Welcome and thanks for joining. Today's panelists are brilliant and knowledgeable experts who understand voters and voting behavior in all of its complexity. And we are honored to have an elected official as well. Senator Batch is on the front lines as a candidate who asks for votes and gets successfully elected. She lives in North Carolina, a divided state, and sees firsthand the policy and political consequences of the choices made at the ballot box. Right now, there are known ways of studying voters, including age, race, marital status, education, religiosity, geography, and voting history, among some. But are there other ways of understanding the voting eligible population that need exploring? For example, some of the panelists on here are studying double negative voters and the impact they have. There are other considerations, and I will just mention three. Understanding the relationship between issues and emotions. Issues are powerful because they evoke unique feelings among different populations, which in turn helps drive voting choices. For example, Trump, in a very intentional way, elicits fear and anger by engaging in othering and promotes violence when speaking about immigration and immigrants. He thinks this secures his votes and enhances his power. I'm not sure we are as intentional or maybe as adept in raising certain issues to evoke specific feelings in key segments of the electorate. We also may want to explore a person's lived experience and the lived experience, the impact that has on how they vote and the voting choices they make. For example, when a person experiences a loss of income due to divorce or death and is forced to rely on public services for the first time, does that change their perception about the need for government? Finally, the politicizing of the judiciary. The courts are filled with partisans and ideologues. The judicial coup was an intentional strategy implemented over years to thwart and stall progress on countless fronts and ensure a certain power structure. Voters in the Constitution be damned. So if the courts can take away rights and rule independently of elected officials and the voters who put them there, what impact does that have overall on our democracy? But first things first, we must win the White House, Senate, House, and state legislative bodies to safeguard our democracy and enhance it as well. Now, let me turn this over to Erica.
Thanks so much, Paige. It's so good to see all of you here. As Paige mentioned, I'm Erica, and I've been working with a group of others on a project called Innovate for Good that's attempting to source and develop new ideas, create, preserve, and advance thriving democracy. And so today is the second questions this month geared towards what we need to know to win in November, but also geared towards the long term. How do we protect and preserve democracy? And so today we're asking a question really critical to this election, and as I said, critical to the work of innovation. Anyone who knows anything about innovation knows the idea of customer discovery, right? Understanding who are we seeking to serve. And in this sense, when it comes to democracy, we're asking ourselves, who is the electorate? And we're understanding beyond just basic demographic information, but if behavior will lead us not just to what we want in November, but to better ideas and a better ability to reach and engage with actual power. We know who that is, that's the voters. So today we're going to hear from 5 brilliant experts like Paige mentioned. You're going to see presentations from them, and then we're going to turn to some conversation and Q&A. So as you hear from them, if you have questions and comments, feel free to submit them in the Q&A function, and we'll pull them and be able to have a great conversation afterwards. So you're going to hear today from Geoff, widely recognized as one of the most influential media strategists. I'm going to turn it over to Geoff Garin, president of Hart Research, conductor of national and battleground states from many national Democratic Party organizations. Then, as Senator Sidney Batch, currently serves as Democratic Deputy Leader in the North Carolina Senate. She's going to turn it over to Tom Bonier, veteran political strategist, currently serving as CEO of Garin Group and senior advisor to TargetSmart. And last but certainly not least, I'm going to go over to Carlos Odio, the research and overall strategy renowned for the best in research and polling on Latino voters. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Geoff.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit as a senior advisor of the Lincoln Project about the structure that we see the race in today and get into some of the groups that we are targeting. The structure of the race is, we've always believed was a 46 Trump, 53 not Trump vote. And the current ABC Ipsos poll has Harris at 52 and Trump at 46. It sort of aligns with our thinking. It happened because Harris is consolidating the Democratic base of support, winning African Americans now up in the high 80s, young voters back up to 59% support, Latinos 59. These were all groups that Biden wasn't doing as well with. But we specifically believe Harris has room to grow with two very specific key groups. Getting to what Paige had talked about at the beginning here, about how we look at targeting and being able to go after specific voters. We call them the Dobbs dads and Red Dawn conservatives. Now, there's a big opportunity to expand. What we've got at it's the Lincoln Project's Lincoln Democracy Institute has identified two target buckets. The Dobbs dads are fathers who are Republican and have daughters at 15, 14, 16 years of age, and even younger, but they've always believed they were defenders of the daughters in their lives. And they are having problems after Dobbs staying with Trump, and particularly with J.D. Vance coming in. We believe this group is very targetable. There's like literally a couple of 100,000 of them in the state of Pennsylvania alone, just to give you a specific place where they were not available to Biden. They didn't see Biden as strong enough. Kamala Harris in the debate has started to move them in her direction. The other group is Red Dawn conservatives. These are Reagan, older. They supported Reagan. They remember him saying, Gorbachev, tear down that wall. They recall George H.W. Bush presiding over the fall of the wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, and have real problems with Trump and J.D. Vance's support of Russia, Putin, and standing against Ukraine. It's just not what they saw as Reagan Republicans. And again, this group was hard for Biden to get to because of the strength-weakness thing that Trump was doing. That's no longer the case with Kamala Harris. So those two groups are very potential targets that we're going after. Lastly, I will say I also work for Citizens Save Our Republic with Dick Gephardt and others that have been focused on third parties. We're seeing very significant drop-off of third parties. We continue to be focused on Stein as a potential problem that could, but we don't believe so. Right now, we're just being vigilant about monitoring the third-party situation. But that was a big possibility of people going, either falling off, not voting, or voting for third parties. We don't see that as big a problem as it once was. And with that, I'll turn it over to Geoff Garin.
Great. Thank you, Joe, and thanks everybody for joining. I know a lot of you want to go out and help elect Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, and I want to share some thoughts about what you might be saying to folks about why it's important to do that. Just as sort of a tent pole that starts the conversation, we think voters want to turn the page on Donald Trump, that they are tired of the division and hate and chaos that he generates, often deliberately. And by talking about that, about the opportunity that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz offers to turn the page on Trump, and it does make him the incumbent in a way, or the problem to be solved. This is still very much of an electorate that is unhappy with the status quo, and they're still looking for change, and part of what we want to do is define the election as a way of changing from the malign influence that Donald Trump has had on our country since he entered politics. The opposite of that is Kamala Harris, who offers a new way forward, and we want to kind of stress that she represents this fresh perspective and a positive vision for the future. And when we talk about that, we think it's really important to focus on her commitment and determination to rebuild the middle class, to lower costs for working families, to reduce violence in our country, and very importantly, to strengthen our rights and freedoms, particularly the rights and freedoms of women. In terms of kind of extending the narrative about the importance of turning the page on Donald Trump, we want voters, it's really important for voters to know and understand that a second Trump term will be much more extreme and dangerous than the first one. We run into a lot of voters who say, well, we survived the first 4 years, why wouldn't we survive the next one? He kind of was good for me on the economy. What's the big deal? And the big deal is that if you put him back in office, it's going to be much worse than it was before. And in terms of telling that story about why it will be much worse than before, we want to talk about the fact that he, A, has a plan in the form of Project 2025 that he will be executing on, and that he's now surrounded by a team of far-right extremists who will help him implement that plan. That I think the kind of the extended version of that is that there were people in the first term who were able to stop Trump from following his worst instincts. They're all gone. They now oppose Donald Trump, and he's surrounded instead by these people who come at things from an extreme far-right perspective. We want to stress that in terms of Project 2025, that the centerpiece is changes that are designed to give him unprecedented and unchecked power over our government, and that he's going to use that power for malign purposes, mainly to take revenge on his opponents and to silence people who disagree with him. We want to focus on his assault on our basic rights and freedom, particularly that if given a chance, he will continue to impose more restrictions on women's access to their reproductive health care, and that he will appoint more and more judges to the courts, like the ones who overturned Roe versus Wade, and get people to reckon with the reality that that will lock in a MAGA court for generations to come. And finally, on economics, we want to make clear that his focus is not on helping the middle class, but on giving big tax breaks to the wealthy and big corporations that will come at the expense of the middle class in terms of health care, Social Security, and that they'll end up footing the bill for his import tax by paying an extra $4,000 a year. In terms of Vice President Harris's new way forward, we want to have an economic focus to that, both in terms of a relatable personal story, that she is from the middle class, that she is focused on delivering real stability, security, and opportunity to the middle class, and that in doing that, her number one priority is to lower costs for working families and seniors. And she's, over the course of the past several weeks since she's become a candidate, she's sort of enumerated the ways in which she would do that, cracking down on price gouging, addressing the crisis of the unaffordability of housing and the high rents, extending drug pricing reforms to lower healthcare costs and drug costs for more people. We definitely want to feature her leadership and the strength of her purpose in opposing Trump's extreme abortion bans, and in giving women the right again to make their own reproductive health care decisions without government interfering in those decisions. And then finally, we do want to emphasize, as people learn more about Kamala Harris, that she comes to this as a prosecutor and a state attorney general who has a very strong record that demonstrates her commitment to protecting the safety and security of families and the communities in which they live. She has a powerful record in terms of fighting predators and cartels and drug traffickers, that we want to remind people of that, and that she's going to take that record as president to a continuing commitment to keeping Americans safe, including by standing up to the drug lobby to deal with the plague of gun violence that we experience all across the country. So that's the main things I want to share with you, and look forward to the conversation. And I especially look forward to hearing next from Senator Batch.
Thank you, guys, and good afternoon. So I am State Senator Sidney Batch, and I serve in our very divided government. North Carolina is interesting in that we have a Democratic governor, but we have a supermajority of Republicans both in the House and the Senate. And so over the course of time, we have been able, can you all hear me? I can't hear anything.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes, Senator, we hear you
Okay.
well. Thank you.
All right. Sorry for that. Technology is great when it works. And so over the course of time, what we have seen from 2018 until now, and really 2010 when the Republicans ended up taking over, we are in a unique situation where our voters are, they're not pretty typical. I mean, we can have a Democratic governor like we have in Governor Cooper, which has been over the last, he's had 2 terms, but we've also had Republicans controlling the state. I would tell you that that's probably because of the gerrymandering that we have, and that our Supreme Court, which is now predominantly controlled by Republicans, is put in a situation where uniquely we are actually seeing that if you can gerrymander your way, like many of you already know, your districts in the House and in the Senate, it doesn't matter what happens, you can actually just have a supermajority. And that's what the Republicans have successfully done. I've run in 4 different elections since 2017, and I have been in 4 different districts. Okay. Doesn't make any sense, but that's exactly what happens. And so what we see is on a statewide level, we have a lot of voters who will vote for a Democratic governor and then a Republican senator or House member. So we're trying to figure out how to go ahead and get to those voters and communicate with them effectively about what matters. You've heard from everyone already, and what Geoff just said with regards to Vice President Harris. She has gotten a lot of momentum and excitement for our voters. And so we're seeing an increase of turnout and excitement and enthusiasm with our base voters. And when our base voters show up to the polls, they vote all the way down. However, we do have a few voters who don't do that, right? So you have some of those voters who will go back and forth between the Republican and the Democrat. What I would tell you, in one of the frustrating parts of being in a state legislature, is that I think that we have for far too long have allowed for our legislature and basically the narrative in the media to be that we just have to care about the federal government. But what we have seen, and you all know all too well, is that state governments actually control so much more of your day-to-day life. And so just this year, when the Governor Cooper lost his ability to veto any of the terrible bills that we actually sustained over the course of 4 years, we sustained 48 terrible bills. And sadly, when he lost that veto last year, they have now just pushed all of those through. And so when you talk about the day-to-day existence and life and things that matter, it's not the federal government that took away abortion rights and significantly restricted abortion rights in North Carolina. That was a supermajority of Republicans. It wasn't that the federal government decided not to fund our schools and to provide private care vouchers in the tune of $1 billion to the most wealthy families in North Carolina and to take it away from our public schools. That was a supermajority of Republicans. It wasn't the same thing with regards to the fact that the federal government didn't change our actual voting rights here in North Carolina and restrict the early voting process to put in voter ID and to also make it very difficult for many people to actually get access to voter ID. That was a supermajority of Republicans. And so I hope that when we're moving forward and we're talking to voters and we're trying to figure out effective communication methods, is that what I can tell you, being in some of the most, I've either been in, until this election cycle, the most competitive House or Senate seat that I have run in, what I can tell you is that if someone comes out to vote for a state legislative candidate, they're definitely voting at the top of the ticket and all the way down. But the reverse is not true. So there will be some coattails, and it's going to be really exciting and amazing that we're going to have Vice President Harris on the ticket, because we've seen the enthusiasm in the state of North Carolina. Just last week, she sold out, didn't sell tickets, but had a rally where there were 17,000 people that showed up. There was people outside that couldn't get in, and she sold, and it was a sellout crowd of a stadium. of a huge coliseum. And so we see that enthusiasm. My concern for state legislatures and for North Carolina in particular is because we're so gerrymandered, we have to go ahead and overperform in so many different categories. And this is the first year that we're actually going to have in a major election voter ID. And so I'll give you a perfect example. We have cut the funding for the Department of Motor Vehicles, and there's just waiting lists for forever to get your ID, to get a license, et cetera. So a new voter that I know who moved from California ended up coming here, and she was sitting there, went in and said, okay, I just moved here. I know that I want to register to vote. She went to go ahead and make an appointment at the DMV, and they could not get her in until December. So she had to go through the process of using her social security card to go ahead and apply to register to vote because she didn't have a North Carolina ID. And then she had to go to the Board of Elections in her county, very inconvenient, to go ahead and actually get that ID. So I'm happy we have an alternative, but we have created so many barriers, we being the Republicans and supermajority, not me or my Democratic colleagues, to make it so much more difficult for people to vote. So even with that enthusiasm, imagine so many voters in North Carolina who for their entire lives, like my 97-year-old grandmother, has voted in every election, but if she didn't have an ID, which many older North Carolinians and disproportionately people of color do not have IDs, are now going to be faced with being turned away from the ballot. And we've underfunded our elections, and so therefore we're not even able to effectively communicate. So there are a lot of challenges that we have. There's a ton of hope because we are outworking the Republicans, and I'm really excited about that. But I do think as we move forward, it's really important for us to couple the importance of federal and state legislative races together, because without that, we're going to end up having an uphill battle trying to actually win back our states when the federal government is losing more authority per the Supreme Court's decisions and allowing states to make those decisions that are essentially the most important that most people certainly think about and work toward and talk about at the kitchen table every single day. And so I look forward to the conversation and thank all of you for what you are doing on the outside. Democracy is certainly a team sport. We need every single person involved in it. And so with that, I turn it over to Tom.
Thank you, Senator. It's great to be here with everybody. So I'm going to talk about voter registration data. Y'all who paid attention to some of the stuff that I've shared in the past know it's something I sort of geek out about. The reason why is pretty simple. If we think about the equation as we assess where this race stands, there's two big parts to state the obvious: who's going to vote, how they're going to vote. Obviously, the polling is giving us a great sense of how people are going to vote in the issues that they're bearing in mind and how people are moving and everything that Geoff talked about. But there's the secondary question of who's going to vote. And to a large extent, the past vote history gives us a pretty high level of confidence of that. The big question is what sort of variations in turnout we might see from prior elections or even from our expectations. And what we found is looking at these new voter registration trends can be helpful, can provide helpful insight in terms of where there's more intensity, excitement, and enthusiasm, and where perhaps there's less. And so you think about this year, and I included a chart here. It's something I think a lot of people have shared. It's not mine. It's something that's been going around on Twitter. And you see that, frankly, there's been a deficit for Democrats over the course of this cycle, where Republicans have been out registering Democrats. But I think a lot of people have probably seen and heard this. When you look at what happened after President Biden withdrew from the race, endorsed Vice President Harris, we saw this really explosion of registration, new registrations, not just in battleground states, but really around the country, red, blue, and purple states, led by young voters, women, and voters of color. And when you look at the intersection between those three groups, young women of color, you see numbers that don't seem real, frankly. Now, in terms of raw numbers, these are relatively small. In terms of the potential that it could mean in terms of turnout, it's hopeful. The other thing that I want to add here, in terms of the debate, everyone's talking about Taylor Swift, and as a dad to two teenage daughters, nothing new to me in terms of Taylor Swift's influence. But what we've seen just in the data that we've gotten since the debate and then the subsequent endorsement and the vote.gov sharing is actually a huge increase in interest in registering to vote, which I think is positive. The thing we have to keep in mind, most voter registration actually happens in most states, those who don't have the more restrictive deadlines, in the weeks coming, and many states right up through Election Day. So there's a lot of work to be done. To that, I want to share something very quickly here, and then I want to hand it over to Carlos. Some data from the Senator State of North Carolina for a lot of reasons. I think it's just obviously incredibly important. It's great that we're all now nationally paying a lot more attention to the state. And as you'll see on this dashboard, what we show is the ability to look at new voter registrations over the last few election cycles. And here I sort of cut it off right before our candidate change. And you see what I was talking about. Over the course of this year, prior to that point, in 2020, we were out registering Republicans by about a 2-point share. But in this year, this election cycle, we actually had a 5-point deficit. Now, if I move forward and look just at this time period, actually since the withdrawal and Vice President Harris taking over at the top of the ticket, you see things actually flip. Over this same time period in 2020, Republicans were out registering us. What's happened in North Carolina since July 21st is Democrats are out registering. I do want to note the unaffiliated numbers are incredibly high. We engaged in a great project with Paige and her team looking at double negative voters. A lot of them we know are these unaffiliated voters. We're able to model partisanship. And when you look at the modeled, a lot of those unaffiliated voters, in fact, overwhelming majority of them actually look like Democrats and should vote like Democrats if we can communicate our message to them. And if you go to targetsmart.com, you can actually see this dashboard yourself, play with it, and we'll send out, I'm sure we can send out these links and more of this analysis afterwards.
I was looking over his shoulder, and I can see his laptop, and it's
real.
exactly what he was telling us.
No, the points are really important, but the tool is great too, and we'll send it out.
Thank you.
It's fun to play with.
And it was a very clear word picture.
Yes. Yes.
Carlos, you can save us now.
No, well, this is why I'm going to keep mine low tech. So thank you, Tom. So I'm here to talk about Latino voters, where we find ourselves right now, and what I think is coming down the pike, and what I think is going to affect where the vote ends up at the end of the day. We're actually releasing results today from our latest battleground poll. This is from pre-debate. I think there's probably some movement since the debate that this isn't fully capturing. That said, we have in the 7 battleground states, we have the VP up 56-38 over Trump. Now, if we'd shown you our polling a couple of months ago, when it was President Biden, we were in a very different world. We were seeing numbers that, had they come to pass, would have been historic for Republicans in the modern era. We had Biden up only 5 points, 46-41 at that point. So when Kamala Harris enters the race, what you get is a reset. You get numbers that start to look far more familiar, far more like they were in 2020. Now, Harris is still not at full 2020 levels. Even looking in poll measures, is shy in the battleground states, about 4 points off in two-way vote, from where Biden ended up in 2020 election. That's not a lot, but it's still meaningful on the margins in states that matter. But there's variation across states. While she is 6 points shy in Georgia, she's only 1 point shy in Nevada. Incredibly important, right? Nevada's always going to give us a heart attack, even if the last several elections it has come through for Democrats since 2012, actually since 2010, I should say. Only 2 points shy in Pennsylvania, 3 points shy in Arizona. The way coalition math works, it depends what she's going to need, depends on what she is getting from other groups, what turnout and share of the composition of the electorate looks like. That said, I'd say what she is getting in Nevada is probably enough if everything else holds steady, whereas in Arizona probably needs to do a little bit better given the closer margins that we are seeing there. But I want to talk about what's left, right? There's only about 6-7% who are undecided. When we do all of our calculations around who's really swing, we take out the people who aren't. It's still around 7-8% of Latinos who are in that category. But there are other elements of uncertainty. If history is any guide, at least 30% of the Latinos who vote in 2024 will not have voted in 2020. So things like new registration that Tom was talking about end up being incredibly critical. Actually, Harris has a big plus 31 advantage around new registrants in our last poll. There's another segment who are low propensity Latinos who've been registered in the past but didn't turn out. they are very much in flux. They are the kind of voter who is deciding whether to vote at the same time that they're deciding who to vote for. That is the kind of voter among whom Donald Trump made his gains with Latinos in 2020, and we've seen them go back and forth. And so that is adding an element of volatility to what otherwise looks like static numbers in the most recent polls. So Harris actually down 10 among this segment of 2020 non-voters, as opposed to being plus 31 among new registrants. So there is a lot of actual persuasion to be done, even if some of the persuasion targets look like mobilization targets. That wall is kind of a false wall when it comes to Latinos. One of our main points we try to urge is to adopt a persuasion mindset, even when at the end of the day, we are thinking about turnout. One of the other key things is, of course, in a campaign to pick the right fight. And so one thing I'll say, the economy is a big strength for Donald Trump. Harris, in terms of who is going to be better on the US economy, Trump and Biden Harris and Trump are tied on this measure. That is actually a big improvement. Trump was up 6 over Biden on better on the US economy a couple of months ago. But when you ask who is going to be better for the middle and working class family, Harris is up 20, has a 21-point advantage. When you ask who cares about people like me, it is a plus 26 advantage for Harris. So how we define the economy, what economy are we talking about? Is this going to be a referendum on who is better on the US economy? Or is this going to be a referendum on who cares and delivers for middle and working class families? And so how do you pick the right fights? Harris has been leaning into the opportunity economy. We see the value in talking about that. All of the policies there are incredibly popular. None is below 70% support, some of the biggest numbers we've seen for policy this cycle. And that's even among those who think that Trump is better on the economy. Actually, those who think that Trump would be much better on the US economy, there's still majority support for capping prescription drug prices, for expanding child tax credit, for paid family leave. So it's to say there is new information to provide to these voters to help shape their vote at the end of the day. But the last point I'll make here is about inviting Latino voters to vote. So Latinos do not assume that any message targeted broadly is inclusive of them, that they are being mentioned unless they are mentioned explicitly. They do not assume they are being invited to the party. Latinos have to be invited to the party. But Latinos don't want to be invited to a separate party. They want to be invited to the big party. They want to know that everybody else is going to the same one as them. And so it's so important as we talk about this work, as you do communications, to not alienate Latinos, even while trying to be explicit. So even language that says all Americans, all hardworking Americans, including Latinos, want an expanded child tax credit is so much more effective than just simply saying Latinos. Latinos don't want to be pandered to, but they do want to be included.
Okay, I think you all gave such brilliant information. My mind is like firing on all cylinders here. And we also got some really good questions in. So what I'm going to ask of the panelists is just to I'm going to maybe call and toss a question to somebody specific, but if you have thoughts and reactions, don't hesitate to jump in because we want this to be as conversational as possible. So a lot of the questions that came in are really about kind of understanding the voters, what is moving them, what are they responding to in this moment. One, I'm going to direct directly to Senator Batch because it's about something that's happening here in North Carolina, right? And this person says they've been reading a lot about the issues with getting RFK Jr. on off the ballots, leading North Carolina to need to reprint the vote by mail ballots. And so the question is really, in your experience, and anyone can answer, but obviously let's start with you, Senator Batch. What are average voters thinking about efforts to throw off voting systems and cause chaos, right, for election officials? It's happening a lot. We know it's being reported on, but how are voters responding to that reality?
So I think that's a great question, but I think many voters aren't actually paying a whole lot of attention because if you're in a situation where you're trying to put food on your child's table, a roof over their head, working 2 jobs, I mean, we still have federal minimum wage, and a lot of people are struggling in North Carolina. The average voter doesn't know. Now, those in the know are very concerned because when the decision was made by our Supreme Court to take RFK off, they did not give any additional funding to reprint all of those ballots. My sister, for instance, lives in London. If anyone has actually been in a position where you've had to worry about the post office recently getting mail, I'm a lawyer with my other job that actually pays my bills. And we have had a delay in a ton of mail. It has literally taken me a week and a half sometimes to go ahead and get our mail back. So my concern is that when you have somebody who lives in London, like my sister, who still votes in North Carolina, and when you have our military, which we have obviously multiple military members and veterans in this state, what's going to happen when we changed our laws and it says the cutoff is 3 days. It doesn't matter what happens. Whether it's a hurricane, which we have had plenty in North Carolina, you're going to actually invalidate a number of votes, and that is going to cause a lot of chaos. So outside of just removing his name from the ballot, I think that those of us in the know are really trying to work hard on trying to figure that out. We're actually much more concerned about the most recent changes in our election laws that are going to prevent us counting valid ballots after the arbitrary deadline that they put into law and that the governor overrode. Sadly, we weren't able to sustain it, but that's now in law. And again, like I said, this is the first year that we're also going to have voter ID.
Got it. Got it. You started that by talking about the fact that many voters might not even be paying attention to that, right? Because there's some very real pressing issues that are affecting everyday Americans in their lives. I think that relates really nicely to another question that came in just about a lot of these talking points trying to convince undecided to vote for Harris. The pushback that people are hearing is that, like, look, the issues that people are talking about may not relate to me personally, right? I personally don't have student debt, or I personally bought my house without credit. How are people supposed to, and this is a question again from someone who I believe is probably engaging directly with voters daily, how can you actually connect? What messages are moving people? How do you connect people who say, like, but what policy is relevant to me specifically, right? And maybe let's toss this to Geoff.
Well, I'm glad you used the word conversation, because that's part of what makes all of this work. That is, you're not just talking to people, but listening to people, finding out what's important to them when you're having these conversations, and being able to answer in ways that are kind of relevant and material to their interests. And on the Harris website, for example, there's kind of a fairly extensive policy page now, and you can kind of educate yourself on various ways of answering questions. But the truth is that what we find is that the issues that I talked about, for example, may not affect an individual voter personally, but they affect somebody in their family. So Joe talked about the Hobbs dads who care about their daughters and whether they want a future where their daughters have fewer rights than their mothers did. That Donald Trump will decimate Medicaid spending when if he becomes president again. Medicaid is now quite a popular program in the public, but it funds health care for a lot of seniors, particularly people who need nursing home care. It funds health care for families with a disability, a child with severe disabilities, so that you can connect to people's personal stories. And then at a higher level, I think all Americans feel an investment in kind of protecting our democracy, bringing people together, unifying the country, kind of everything that is the opposite of what Donald Trump is. And I think you can connect to voters' emotions around those issues as well.
Can I just
That's great.
add with Geoff that it's the conversation's really important, but the messenger can be really important. So with Dobbs dads, the messenger is daughters. I mean, daughters talking to their fathers right now about what they're concerned about in this election. That's where Taylor Swift, I mean, talking to to her father. I mean, that is what this is about. And I think for just that one group as an example, wherever we are, and particularly in these battleground states, urging daughters to talk to their fathers is actually a way to move those men. We saw in the slides that that the gender gap is big, but men are a problem or a place where we need to move people. And I think the biggest messengers are the daughters of those fathers out there. They can make a big difference.
I think this relates also to the new registrants that you're seeing. I mean, in terms of the surge of new registrants and how much are they paying attention, which clearly they are paying attention to what's going on in the operating environment, but how does that really translate to the number of people who vote and the impact overall on the election?
Yeah, it's a question I get a lot about the new registrants, because again, as I said, the relative numbers, we're talking about hundreds of thousands, not millions, right? If you look at any given recent election, first-time voters are generally somewhere between 7 and 12 or 13% of the electorate. It's not nothing, but keep in mind in 2020, over 160 million people voted. So that means there's a much smaller pool of first-time voters available. How much of an impact could they have? We think back to Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, how close they are. Hopefully they won't be that close again. We have to expect that any state could be. They have the potential to have an impact anywhere. But I do think the bigger potential meaningful element of the information we're looking at is if it is predicting larger turnout from those groups overall. And as you said, we look at those groups, especially younger voters and younger voters of color. We know that they were not very engaged in this election at all prior to July. And there are great indicators that they are much more engaged now. If that means not only that we're getting more first-time voters, especially young women of color, but we're getting more of those voters who maybe came out for the first time in 2020 and haven't voted since coming out, that's a good thing for the Harris campaign.
Yeah, I think
one of the questions.
Go ahead, Erica.
No, please, Paige, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I do think the new registrants show what's happening in the operating environment writ large, and that's why in some ways it's the point you're making is so encouraging.
And I'm actually going to double back there with you, Tom, because one of the questions that came in is about the science of polling and how much it has changed. And so even all of this information that we're gathering right now, one of the questions is how accurate is it, right? We know how much has changed, both as Paige said in the operating environment, but specifically with polling. What do we know about the accuracy of polling now, and how reliable is it? And maybe even comparing it.
Well, Geoff's sitting right next to me. I better watch out what I say. No, well, if I could, I'd like to hear from Geoff and Carlos on this as well. But we hyper focus on like the public polls and the five, and I do this myself. I'm more guilty than anyone, and that certainly undersells the accuracy of polling because you have a lot of, frankly, garbage public pollsters who are out there. We saw this in 2022, almost entirely on the right side of the aisle, who are putting out bad polls and who gave us a skewed sense of the electorate. At the same time, you have some very good pollsters, public pollsters, and even better campaign pollsters and folks on the inside who are not, frankly, probably the least important thing that y'all are doing is predicting outcomes of race, but more directing ways we can win races. And so, yeah, I think obviously polling has become more challenging for a lot of reasons, but good pollsters innovate, do things differently. And again, probably one of the less important things that they do is predicting outcomes. And so, yeah, with these new registrants, I get that question a lot too. So, oh, you're seeing a lot of these new registrants. Are they included? Is it going to skew the results? It's not the new registrants who are likely to skew the results. Yes, if they're pulling their sample from a voter file, they're not going to show up there, but that might be 2% of their respondents. It's not enough to have an impact. The question is when they're looking at their weighting or their quotas or anything else, and they're deciding what percent or women versus men, Dems versus Republicans versus independents and everything else, predicting turnout is hard. And I don't have a crystal ball. And so we look at potential outcomes, ranges of outcomes, and what turnout could look like within the bounds of what happened in the past. And so again, I know, having worked with folks like Geoff and Carlos, that's what they do. But in the public realm, you just generally don't get to see that. So you're going to see less accuracy in those public polls than you're going to see in what they're doing behind the scenes.
In our work, every poll we do across the swing states or in a particular swing state. Our respondents are matched to the voter file, generally the voter file that Tom's firm maintains. And if you look at the voter file as a whole, you can have a pretty good idea of what the electorate should look like. Not just in terms of demographics, but in terms of a lot of political attributes and life experiences as well. And so, you know, our business these days is making sure that our samples at a very deep level, so not just for the total sample, but within subgroups, looks like what we expect the electorate to look like. Tom is right that the biggest challenge is deciding, you know, who's going to turn out and who won't. I think in a presidential election year, we generally have a good idea of that. But even in in a presidential election year, people, in addition to the new registrants that Tom's talked about, people do cycle in and out of the electorate, so that, you know, in any given presidential year, including this one, you can have 20% of the electorate being people who didn't vote in the previous election. That's about what we expect to happen. And figuring out who those people are the bigger challenge than other aspects of making polling accurate. What we were seeing before President Biden withdrew is that we expected this pool of non-2020 voters to be favorable to the Republicans. Right. But since July 21st, we've seen a major reverse in that. So among the people in our sample who were non-2020 voters, there's an advantage to Vice President Harris. I do want to say one thing about the public polls. Joe mentioned some of them at the beginning that showed a substantial lead for Vice President Harris. I don't really think that's what the election is like today. This is a very, very, very close election. It's going to be hard fought. It's going to be hard fought in North Carolina. It's going to be hard fought in Georgia. It's going to be hard fought across the 7 battleground states. And so if you look at those national polls and say to yourself, I don't have to work as hard, get rid of that thought. This is really,
immediately.
This is really going to be a very difficult election, and it's as Senator Batch said, this is all hands on deck kind of experience that we're about to have.
Well, I would add to that. Biden won 51% of the vote, 46.7 for Trump. So when you look at that ABC poll and it says 52-46, roughly the same number. Remember, 14,000 votes in Georgia, right. 44,000 votes. So Geoff's completely right. I didn't mean to infer that there was a big margin here, but that right now there are advantages that we need to take, and that there are things like Dobbs, Dads, and Red Dawn Republicans that we still can go after and get and help make that differential in those key states.
I'm interested in, let me just ask Carlos a question, which is, I mean, you look at one key part of the electorate so closely, and getting that specific on, you know, one sector of the electorate. I mean, what are your challenges in terms of, you know, this quote unquote accuracy issue?
All right, and look, these are polls, not prophecies. Anyone who is looking for some sacred number that is going to hold up till the end of the day, that's not how campaigns use polling. And there have been innovations that have helped us improve this over time. I think most good pollsters at this point are waiting on 2020 vote. What we care about is change over time and understanding how things are different from the last election. Why Equis exists is because you have a lot of dynamism that is coming from smaller segments of the electorate. Latino is a small but growing piece. In some states, it is obviously much larger, and it can be harder to get some subset exactly right. And so what we do is go deeper on that, help everybody gain a better understanding of where Latino voters are at, including as a resource to other pollsters. There are challenges, not just in language, but understanding differences that cut across differences by generation, by country of origin, other interactions that are unique to Latino voters, the differences across states and even within state geographies that can be hard to get exactly right, so we can provide guidance to others.
Thanks, Carlos. And let me just, for our last question, I'm going to want to hear from everyone, but I'm going to give you max 3 words. Each of you get 3 words to answer this question. Where should volunteers focus their efforts in swing states? That was the question that came in, and I thought it was a great place, good action item to end on. Where should volunteers focus their efforts in swing states? Let's start with Senator Batch.
I would say canvassing in our most competitive races. That's where they need to be.
Love it. Love it. Carlos?
Well, I'm very gung-ho on voter registration over the next few weeks. I think that's a big area of focus. Otherwise, I want to see communications that are picking the right fights, whether it's around healthcare, different parts of economic proposals, or immigration, the other side of immigration, which is Trump's mass deportation plans and what he has planned for a second term. And I think getting the right validators out there, especially for something like young Latino men, people who resonate with that audience, different than our candidates do.
All right, Joe, give me 3 words.
Register, canvass, get out the vote. I know it's like 5 words, but that's what I would do.
TFTV can be one word.
Tom?
All the good answers are taken. I'll say people you know. Talk to your people.
That's good. People you know. Geoff?
I'd say phones, doors, and postcards. There are lots of ways to participate. There are lots of things you can do to reach out to voters, people who you don't know. And if you work through a party organization or other organizations, their lists are going to be really good about who to contact. But you don't have to, I mean, if you're able to go knock on a door, that's great. If you can't knock on a door in a swing state, there are other ways for you to reach people, and anything you can do will make a difference.
Fabulous, fabulous. And Paige, I'm going to skip you for now because you're going to have a chance to close and wrap us all out in a minute. I just want to thank the panelists so much for this robust conversation. As we said, this is really for those of us who are interested in innovation and doing better now that we know better. This is really a conversation about customer discovery. How do we have a deep understanding of this electorate that goes beyond traditional demographics and really thinks about behavior and motivation and influences? There's so much more of this conversation to be had. We're going to be continuing it throughout this month for the next 2 Mondays. Again, continuing to figure out what is it, how did we get here with these threats to our democracy, and what do we need to know, not to just win in November, but to set us up for long-term innovation and ultimately building, protecting, and preserving a thriving democracy. I think this conversation was a great step forward in that direction. Thanks again to our brilliant, brilliant panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to Paige for the last words.
Thanks. And I just want to thank everyone who's on and also the folks on the panel, because I think this has been a great discussion. But I do want to echo what Geoff and everyone has said, that this is going to be a very hard-fought election. And it's not just between Harris and Trump or state legislatures or, you know, who's in the House and in the Senate, but it's critical to win those. But this is really about the heart and soul of this country, this election. And so I really do want to emphasize that we have to work so hard to protect what we have worked for so hard to progress to where we are right now and to expand the opportunities for people in this country. So thank you.